Good evening, everybody. Welcome to, or actually good afternoon. We've changed our time frame. We're now 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon after our wonderful SatMag team. I'm Elizabeth Jackson. Our Got Money show today, I've invited Terry Ryder to join us from Hotspotting. Hey, Terry, welcome to Got Money.
It's always lots of fun talking to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, mate.
Rather surprisingly, we always seem to agree on stuff when it comes to real estate. I don't get that
Unusual.
very often, so it's always fun to talk to you.
I was listening to your good news bulletin, which I really love. How long have you been doing that for?
I started doing it when the pandemic first struck, so sort of back in February, March, because we were drowning in media negativity about what was happening and what was going to happen, particularly about real estate. Everyone was lining up to predict that property prices were going to fall off a cliff, and it was just going to be Armageddon for real estate. And I just thought it was unreasonable. There was an absence of balance. So I decided to provide some balance by doing regular good news bulletins. And I found there was a really big audience out there for that. People who were just fed up with the negativity and wanted something a little bit more uplifting. So we've had a good following for that. We continue to do it at least once a week, and it's become very established, one of the things that I do.
It's a very clever thing to do. I was listening to your latest release on the 7th of July. Gosh, I wish I'd started plugging into that at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of kicking myself for not getting in there. Why don't you unpack your latest bulletin for us a little bit and just start leading us down that lovely little pathway that you've created? Because you've started with some really nice little economics, which is one of my favourite topics.
I mean, real estate markets come out of what's happening in economies. I tend to think the local economy is the most important thing, and then you've got a backdrop of the macro factors, the big national economic factors, but that very much dictates what's going to happen with real estate markets. So it's really important to touch on that. And, we've had a series of positive things coming out of that. For example, the OECD and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have both declared in the last few weeks that Australia is in the top 2 or 3 countries in the world in terms of the strength of their economy, the way that they're handling the pandemic period, and their ability to recover coming out the other side. Deloitte, Access Economics, which regularly posts reports about the state of the national economy, fronted by Chris Richardson, who's a bit of a media tart. He's often in front of the cameras talking about the economy in a very colourful way. What they were saying in their report out this week was that the Australian economy is actually doing better. All the numbers that are coming out are showing that Australia is doing better than all the forecasts. And of course, economists love to make these doomsday forecasts. They've been doing it forever anyway, but particularly with the pandemic and particularly about real estate. And they always get it wrong. They're always super negative, and they're always proven to be overly negative, and the outcome's always better than what they predict. And we're seeing that, and that's what Deloitte was saying in their report this week, that that the outcomes that we're seeing in the numbers, particularly retail spending, is one that they highlight. Retail spending has zoomed up again. As soon as we came out of lockdown, people got out there and vented their frustrations by going out and spending in shops and cafes and restaurants and taking the holidays they couldn't take at Easter and all of that. And so, as I've been saying to people, look, it's not going to be as bad as the economists and the media are telling us, and the numbers keep telling us that they got it wrong.
Isn't that a breath of fresh air? Isn't that just lovely? Because you know what, every time I actually don't watch the news anymore, and I'm kind of gathering too that a lot of people out there have stopped watching the news, because it feels like we're being bombarded with, I don't know, sell your houses, move into tents, it's Armageddon. And it's lovely that you've gone ahead and done the good news bulletin. So we're still strong as an international economy. What about jobs and employment?
Look, it's not nearly as bad as what was predicted. Some predictions were saying unemployment was going to go to 15 or 20%, and so far we've seen the highest number so to date has been about 7%. It may go a little bit higher, and particularly what's happened in Melbourne more recently, it may nudge up further. But you would expect unemployment to rise, and it has, but not as badly as some economists had forecast. And even if it goes to 10 or 11%, in terms of the impact on real estate markets, we saw back in the last time Australia had a recession in the early 90s that unemployment was 10 or 11% for quite a while, but we didn't see any major collapse in property values. So I always look at things through the prism of what's the impact on real estate markets, and I continue to be quite optimistic about the ability of real estate to withstand the negative forces of COVID-19. The numbers continue to show that. There's been some decline in some markets, but overall it's been very, very strong throughout March, April, June, now into July. And
what markets are you noticing declines in?
Well, it's primarily the markets that are dominated by high-rise apartments. You know, we've seen a big blowout in vacancies in the Sydney CBD, the Brisbane CBD, the Melbourne CBD. Those are the sort of markets that are most impacted because a lot of people, investors, had apartments they were using Airbnb short-term tenancies, and then when tourism got nobbled, that was no longer working. So they
Nobbled,
dumped
is that a professional term? Nobbled?
It's a technical term which means stuffed. Because of the shutdowns and the closure of borders and the fact that our national borders remain closed and are likely to for some time, and that's had a big impact on tourism. So people who were using those tourism-related platforms with their investment properties like Airbnb suddenly found that they had no income, so they started seeking permanent residential tenants, and that's has caused a blowout in vacancies in those CBD areas and also places like Surfers Paradise and nearby suburbs on the Gold Coast. So those are the markets that are most visibly affected. Sydney overall is more affected than anywhere else for a number of reasons, including the fact that most of Sydney's population comes from overseas migrants, and that's been also nobbled by the situation.
Well, you can't have 250,000 temporary visa holders leave Australia and hope that market's going to sustain itself, because it's just not, is it?
Yeah.
You know, and we're missing our wonderful students from overseas as well, aren't we?
Yeah, so all of that has an impact. So Sydney in various ways is more impacted, but not all of Sydney. It's very important. We've made this point before when we've chatted in these broadcasts that it's important not to generalise. Some parts of the Sydney market are doing really well and will continue to do well. But it's those are the ones that are most affected, more the inner city markets, the ones that have got economies are reliant on tourism. Cairns and Far North Queensland's been impacted. The Gold Coast has been impacted. But there's lots of places around Australia, particularly regional Australia, that are doing really well. In fact, it's almost a case that they're thriving, not so much despite COVID-19, but because of COVID-19.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Just stay with me on the apartment market, because I've got a bit of a theory about that, and I might want to run it past you. A lot of these investors that are holding apartments in these major city holdings, are we going to see a lot of sales after September, particularly in the Sydney and the Melbourne market, do you think, once the banks have decided not to play nicely? Or do you think the banks are going to extend that?
They are, and in fact they announced yesterday exactly that. Like I've been saying in a number of my broadcasts and writings, the columns I write, that this notion of a September cliff and everything's going to collapse in September because the government and the banks are just going to switch off support is absolute nonsense, but typical of what the economists and the media love to perpetrate. You know, they've moved on. The forecast of collapse of property markets hasn't happened, so they're looking around for the next doomsday forecast. So they've settled on the September cliff. And of course, I wrote a column at the start of the week saying, look, it's just not going to happen like that. And here's why. And so I outlined my reasons. And in the last couple of days, both the federal government and the banks have come out and said exactly what I predicted they would do. And that is, they're not just going to shoot themselves in the foot by switching off support in September. The initial announcement was this is until September and then we review it. And the banks announced yesterday that they're going to actually extend those mortgage holidays for those who need it for another 4 months at least, and then they'll review it again. And the federal government's been saying this week, we're not just going to switch off the tap in September. We will review it and we will continue to provide support where it's needed. And there's a whole lot of other factors. And I mean, the stimulus measures like fast tracking infrastructure is going to be hugely beneficial. And probably the biggest stimulus benefit of all has come from the home builder package. $25,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but multiplied by thousands of people doing it, the reality is that, as the research shows, that the economic multiplier effect of housing construction is the second greatest of any economic sector in Australia. So if people are out there building new houses, boosted by the grant from the federal government, and we're seeing evidence that that's exactly what's happening in droves, then that's going to be a huge stimulus thing. So all these things are in the mix, and I just believe we're not going to have that September cliff at all. We're actually going to be, apart from Melbourne and its current situation, we're increasingly coming out of lockdown. Businesses are reopening, people going back to work. By the end of September, it's going to be a whole new world, I believe. And that's me, the optimist, of course. But I think we need more optimism at the moment. It's actually what I find talking to people out there at the coalface of the real estate industry. There's an amazing amount of optimism because people have found, hey, we're still doing business, we're still making sales. Deals are still being done despite all the negativity in the media. Things haven't collapsed. So
I have never been in a market in my life where it is a better time to secure a property. Like in my life. The 25, although I've got to say, it'd be nice to have some legislation around the home builders grant. It'd just be nice. A shame there isn't. But when we look at that environment, that additional $25,000, regardless of how they're going to give it to the purchaser, I'll leave that in their hands, and the incentives that builders are actually putting on the table for purchasers, we've got some really wonderful outcomes for families that otherwise wouldn't establish themselves into the real estate market. And it's a real privilege to be in that space right now because we're helping families that otherwise wouldn't secure a home. And there's something really gorgeous about that. You spoke to Nathan too from the loan deposit scheme, and he's doing very well. He said 5,500 people have secured their first homes already in that scheme.
Yeah. Well, that's right. See, it is the best time ever. And I know people tend to make these sweeping statements, but I really believe this to be true. There has never been a better time to be a first home buyer in Australia, and there probably never will be a time as good as this.
Yeah.
Because we've got interest rates as low as they could possibly ever go, and we've got a range of schemes at both the federal and state government level to help first home buyers, provided they can get past the roadblocks provided by lenders who are being a bit mongrel at the moment.
Oh, Jesus. We're seeing files taking 8 weeks to come back.
I know. They always go overboard in one direction or another, and they're doing that with caution at the moment. But in terms of
it's like you're getting a lolly and a snap. It's like you're getting a lolly and then a slap, though, Terry. It's like the lolly slap of real estate. Like, seriously.
Yeah. I would urge first home buyers to not be daunted and to persist, because this is your opportunity. You've got the home builder grant, you've got the first home buyer scheme, which means you just need a 5% deposit. You don't have to pay mortgage insurance. You've got stamp duty concessions and other grants at a state government level. It's such a leg up. It's just a great time. And you're not competing with a lot of investors right now, because investors are sort of sitting on the fence primarily. So, and prices in most markets aren't sort of rising to the level that they were prior to COVID-19. So everything's in their favour. Great time to get in there, and you've just got to persist and get yourself through that tough phase with the borrowing from the banks. And then once you get through that, you're set up for life potentially.
I think so. The only remark I have to make about that before we move on is that the titled land prices have gone up exponentially. We saw, as soon as they made the announcement, titled land went up by about $25,000 all the way across Melbourne, which kind of feels a bit like a bit naughty behaviour really by the landowners, but also taking advantage of the fact that they were going to have a major rush on. It hasn't impeded buyer interest at all, and people understand that. For us right now, we're in the phase called let's get valuation and see what happens, because a lot of our clients are subject to finance. Because when you all of a sudden increase land across the board over a day, the banks are sending valuers in and they're scratching their head saying, could we see the last 12 months worth of sales in this land estate? So that's an interesting hurdle. So you're optimistic about what areas particularly in Australia right now?
Look, more so than other parts, regional Australia is really pumping, with the exception of those locations where it's primarily about tourism, they've taken a hit. But locations that, regional cities that have a nice, well-rounded economy are doing really well. There was a trend already underway, and you know about it, and we've talked about it, the one where people are sort of leaving the big cities and going and living in lifestyle locations within 1 to 2 hours of the capital city. And Victoria's been huge for that. Places like Bendigo and Ballarat and the hill change towns in the north, because they can commute or they can telecommute, they can work from home. Now, the lockdown has exacerbated that and has made more people aware of the potential to work from home. Therefore, we don't need to be in the big, expensive, congested inner city. We can actually move to Gisborne or Castlemaine or Kyneton or Ballarat or Bendigo and have a wonderful lifestyle, more affordable, less congested. We can actually sell our place in Melbourne, buy something nice in Bendigo, for example, have money left over, and just a whole different ballgame. And so those places are really getting lots of demand out of the capital cities. It's not just Victoria, it's happening around the places that are close to Sydney, it's happening in Queensland. It's a big trend, a big trend. And so a trend that was already underway has been exacerbated. And so we're seeing some of these places absolutely thriving because of COVID-19.
Yeah, I did some numbers actually. I wanted to share them with you. I've got it on my screen over here because you talk a lot about Bendigo, right? I was talking to a client the other day who said, I just want to get a place in Cranbourne. It'll eventually be my investment property. And I said, look, let's do the numbers. So we did Cranbourne, and Cranbourne in the last 3 years has gone up 10%. It's solid, 10%'s nice over 3 years. But you look at Bendigo, right? Bendigo's gone up 30.8% over 3 years. Mm. And I said to her, when you look at an investment opportunity, and she's an older woman, she wants to leverage off against her first property and then buy another property. And I said, your game is going to be much longer in an area like Cranbourne. But your opportunity is to consider other areas, particularly regional Victoria, where we've seen enormous growth. I was looking at the Geelong growth too the other day as well, and we've seen anywhere between 33 and 43% from different sources are saying that's been the growth in the last 3 years. Are we going to continue to see that growth in those regional Victorian markets, do you think?
I think we are. And some of them I thought had passed their peak and were going to taper off, like Geelong and Ballarat. But this new situation has actually given them a second surge, I believe. So we're, for example, with our national top 10 best buys reported, it's kind of taken out places like Geelong and Ballarat. But the new edition published just last week, I put Ballarat back in because I feel it's going to have a second wave, not of the virus, but of actually price growth, because that the lockdown has just opened more people's eyes to the potential to not have to be in the high-rise office building in the centre of Melbourne, and they can actually work from home and have a different lifestyle, a more affordable lifestyle in a place that's still very well connected to Melbourne, and they can go there if they need to. So I just think that, and this is what I'm hearing from people at the coalface of the industry too, there's just big demand, and it's not just Victoria, Orange in New South Wales, Wollongong, the Southern Highlands, in Queensland, the Sunshine Coast is pumping really strongly. These are all places like Gympie, which is not too far from where I'm currently sitting, 90 minutes north of Brisbane, on the fringe of the Sunshine Coast, very affordable. Those places are pumping with demand from particularly young buyers for all these reasons.
It's about lifestyle too, isn't it? It's just
Yes,
about,
that's
no,
right.
it's all of that. It's all of those good things. So you're
Yeah, I
optimistic
mean,
about the market. I love that. How unusual from you.
well, yeah, but I mean, the market keeps proving us right, doesn't it? I mean,
Yep.
it's not just sort of pie in the sky, people trying to talk up markets. Australian real estate keeps performing. It has its ups and downs, but ultimately it performs, and it's shown its resilience. The last time we had a recession in the early 90s, post global financial crisis, when 40% declines were predicted in values, but they actually didn't fall at all. They actually rose the next year, after 2009 and 2010. And we're seeing it again. All those predictions that values are going to fall 20, 30% or more, and there's no evidence at all of that happening. There's plenty of markets that are actually still nudging upwards in values. Sydney and Melbourne overall aren't. They've fallen a little, but not much. Not nearly as much as people had predicted, and real estate is just so solid. It's
It's a good
underpinned
investment,
by.
isn't it? It's a good investment.
It is, and it's underpinned by
Says the two
Australian
people that work
culture.
in real estate. It's a good investment. We love it.
Well, it is, but you can't be reckless. You've got to be selective. You've got to do your research, do your homework, employ qualified professionals like yourself to help. Be willing to spend some money on that to make good choices. And if you buy in the right places, the right product in the right places, you will do well. But the people who try and do it on the cheap without spending any money on advice or research are the ones most likely to come a cropper, which you can do in real estate if you make bad choices.
Absolutely. Just to finish up, what are your thoughts about the commercial and retail sectors? I know that that's not really your space. Any thoughts there, considering that people aren't going out much anymore and we're doing everything from home?
Well, I think there's going to be an impact certainly on high-rise offices for the trend we discussed earlier. That idea that people have discovered, hey, I can work from home effectively and I actually like it. And their employers, not everyone, but many employers will like that as well, because if they've got more people working from home and it actually works at both ends, then they can perhaps halve their office costs by they don't need to lease so much office space in the expensive inner city. And that's going to have consequences for the owners of those big buildings. So that's going to be a negative for them, but it's going to be a positive in other areas like residential property.
Yeah.
And
as one loses, the other one wins, doesn't it?
Yeah, and some centres where small retailers, some won't survive this period. Melbourne has just gone into a second lockdown, just as businesses were coming back to open their doors again and employ people again. They've been forced to go back into lockdown. That's devastating for some businesses, and some won't make it. So there's going to be some empty retail spaces for a while, I think, as a consequence of that.
I thought Scott Morrison was really clever to invite the people from Hong Kong into Australia. I thought that was really clever. I thought, well done, Scott. Bring them over. Let's bring their millions of dollars and restabilize our economy. You clever man, you.
Well, it's a good move from a number of respects, but he's probably thinking political more than anything else. We've got the stoush going with China.
Oh, and, not a good move, though. Really, Terry? A fight with China?
Well, I think somebody needs to stand up to China, quite frankly. I think the whole world needs to give China a wake-up call and say, you're a big, powerful economy and nation, but you don't rule the world, and you should really stop trying to. And I'm reading a book about that at the moment. It's a little bit scary from the perspective that's being portrayed in that book. But anyway, that's a whole other subject.
Yeah, let's not dive too much into that water. Thank you for joining me, Terry. Wonderful to have you on the show. Let's touch base in 6 weeks. Let's have you back on, and we'll unravel some more of these wonderful
news bulletins. Let's talk again in 6 weeks and see who's been right. You and me versus the chattering economists who keep talking about Armageddon. I
They
think
annoy me, Terry. I can't even watch them. The language. The only one I really like is Nikki Hutley. I really like Nikki. She's got a really good vibe. She's really pragmatic about the market. And she's a bit of an optimist. So she'd be a good person to have a wine with, Terry.
You're telling me an economist who's an optimist? I didn't think such things existed.
No, she's really good. I've had her on the show a few times. You'd like her. Maybe the three of us could have a wine and ship night and unpick futures. Anyway, my friend, I wish you the very best. Where do my listeners find you for their research?
Hotspotting.com.au. We've actually just launched our new website in the last week or so. It's one of the things we've been doing through the pandemic, treating it as a time of opportunity, and we've created a new and better website for hotspotting.com.au. So check it out and have a look, and you'll find all sorts of great research that can help, if you're interested in property investment, make some good choices.
Always make good choices. Take care, everybody. Thank you to the team at Joy for making it possible for us to record our shows remotely, to my wonderful editor who's in South Australia making us all sound amazing. Carolyn Lloyd, you're incredible. Take care, everybody. As of today, it's 1 p.m. on Saturday for your Got Money show. And I look forward to being with you all again next week.